3,278 days of hell. That's what awaited Jim Thompson as he stared at the burning wreckage of the Bird Dog deep in the dense Vietnamese jungle. The plane's pilot, Captain Richard L. Whitesides, lay lifeless in the mangled cockpit, his body shredded by gunfire. Jim wasn't much better off. The crash had shattered his back, and now AK-47-wielding Viet Cong soldiers were emerging from the shadows of the trees. Jim Thompson was about to become the longest-held American prisoner of war in Vietnam. But his suffering didn't end with his release. It marked the beginning of a new kind of torture. Born Floyd James Thompson in 1933, though he preferred to go by Jim, he was a rebellious kid who didn't have much direction in his life growing up. Unlike a lot of military stories, Jim never felt like the Army was his destiny. He wasn't born into a military family. He spent his young adult years working at a supermarket in Bergenfield, New Jersey, and he married his high school sweetheart, Alice, as early as he could. The direction of his life changed forever in 1956 when he was drafted into the Korean War, not long after graduating high school, where he was first trained as a military clerk. Plenty of young men left that war broken, traumatized, or in a pine box. But Jim wasn't one of those people. The Army challenged Jim's rebel spirit, and he started to appreciate the structure and the discipline it gave him. Maybe he really was meant for a life in the military. It was a decision that not long after would give him the worst years of his life. Floyd was no military genius, but he had the two G's, guts and gumption, and that carried him far. He blazed through officer candidate school, and he soon earned himself the impressive title of Green Beret with the U.S. Army Special Forces at Fort Bragg. From there, he collected certifications like trading cards, powering through Ranger School, Airborne School, and eventually earning a spot as a respected instructor at Fort Benning. By the time the Vietnam War started, he'd served with the 34th Infantry Regiment, where he was a successful platoon leader, the 18th Airborne Corps, and the 1st Special Forces Group, where he served as a staff officer. For a guy still in his 30s, it was already shaping up to be an extremely impressive military career. If you were looking into a crystal ball for Jim at that moment, you probably would have seen a happy retiree with a big country house, a happy family, and a chest covered in medals. And then came Vietnam. Things weren't exactly peachy in Jim's life when he was given a 6-month tour of duty. For some officers, military service was almost like having a second wife, and Alice, now heavily pregnant with the youngest of their 4 children, wasn't exactly eager to share her husband in such a sensitive time. Would he even be in the country for the birth of their child? After all, his devotion to the military profession had made him absent from the first 3. But Jim wasn't worried. The line was that this war would be over soon anyway. An easy victory for the might of the U.S. military machine against a bunch of Vietnamese farmers with Russian and Chinese rifles. How much of a disaster could it really be? The place seemed so irrelevant that before he was even deployed there, Jim, who had gone straight to officer school without even getting a college education, didn't even know where Vietnam was. The cruel irony was that he was going to become a lot more familiar with it than any of the people commanding the war from above him. He began serving in the Military Assistance Advisory Group in the Republic of Vietnam in December 1963, leaving his pregnant wife and children the day after Christmas. All he needed to do was run out the clock for 6 months and return home with another successful tour under his belt. But first, there was a critical mission that he needed to perform. He and an elite team of just 11 Special Forces soldiers were ordered to the Khe Sanh, a remote, high-risk outpost deep in southern Vietnam. Their task was to stem the tide of the North Vietnamese fighters pouring in from neighboring Laos. Their camp was set up near the town of Quang Tri, and Jim was eager to do some reconnaissance and get the lay of the land. And that's why he and one of his fellow soldiers, Captain Whitesides, took a Cessna 01 Bird Dog, a 2-person liaison observation plane, to survey the area. And this was when all hell broke loose. 12 miles out from the camp, Jim and Whiteside suddenly felt the metal-on-metal barrage of multiple rifles firing at their plane from the trees below. With no offensive capabilities to fight back in an observation plane, all they could do was try to perform evasive movements and avoid the bullets of their attackers. But it was already too late for that. A volley of bullets tore through the captain, killing him. Another bullet fired through the outer casing of the plane and ripped across Jim's cheek, making his face a bloody, disoriented mess. The plane plummeted down into the nearby forest with a fiery crash. Jim was burned, thrown from the back seat, and had his back broken. When the local fighters zeroed in on his position, they assumed he was already dead. Though in a rare moment of luck for what was about to be an extremely unlucky time for Jim, he came around just as one of the fighters was pulling out a knife to slice off his ring finger and collect Jim's ruby ring as a prize. Jim gave him the ring, kept all of his fingers, and was handed over to the Viet Cong for his trouble. From there, he was dragged off to the nearest prison camp deep in the murky jungles. When the news broke of his plane going down, the military sent someone to inform Alice and the rest of Jim's family about what had happened. This caused her such a great stress that she went into labor that same night and gave birth to their 4th child. Part of the reason why the Viet Cong took so many American soldiers as prisoners of war was for the potential propaganda victory they provided. Over the course of the war, the conflict and its effect on both Vietnam and the American infantrymen became increasingly unpopular. Cold War talking points about the endless expansion of the Reds across Asia felt less and less like a valid concern when families were having to bury their boys, if their bodies were ever returned at all. The whole war began to look pointless and unfounded at a point. The Viet Cong understood propaganda. They knew that the most effective people for the American public to hear this from were the soldiers themselves. The goal of much of the torture wasn't just pain, it was persuasion. Force them to denounce the war on tape and say America was wrong, and Jim Thompson was no exception. Not long after he was captured, a clip of Jim talking was broadcast over a Vietnamese radio channel. Because war is a patchwork of cruel ironies, he had been viciously beaten into saying that he was being treated wonderfully. But given that Jim had been through a lot, and the recording wasn't exactly studio quality, Alice had no way of knowing whether it was truly her husband on the other end. This left her with a choice: suffer through hope, or admit that in all likelihood he is probably dead and move on. Alice chose the latter and asked the Army to not include Jim's name on the public list of the missing so that she and their children could keep their privacy. At this point, Jim was, for all intents and purposes, dead to the world. But back in Vietnam, the fight was just beginning. For the first several years of his imprisonment under the Viet Cong, he was effectively kept in solitary confinement, alternating between freezing prison cells and bamboo cages barely big enough to move in, exposing him to all of the harshest elements of the Vietnam jungle life. The only people he ever encountered in those long, dark years were his captors, who saw him as less than human, and they treated him every bit as cruelly as that suggests. Pretty much every day, he was viciously beaten with sticks of bamboo, attacks that increased in ferocity every time he made an escape attempt, which he did an astonishing 5 times. But not all the tortures were as simple as that. Sometimes they got downright medieval on the captured major. In one torture, he was suspended by his thumbs for hours, a classic Viet Cong punishment, also described by the late Senator John McCain, who had suffered through a similar grueling ordeal as a prisoner of war. They also resurrected the centuries-old torture of the strapado, popularized during the Spanish Inquisition. Jim's elbows were tied up behind his back and used to hoist him up into the air, which Jim described as feeling like it was making his chest muscles explode open. The isolation was its own form of torture, as were the filthy conditions and the disease. He even contracted malaria during his confinement, which put a strain on his body and his mind. For months, the only food he could keep down was rice gruel, which he was fed sparingly. And due to his broken back, he was unable to sit up unassisted, putting him completely at the mercy of his own torturers. He was also forced to wear painful leg irons to keep him from escaping as he regained his ability to walk. They had only ever removed them for 10 minutes per day under heavy supervision, and they were put on so tight that when they were twisted back into place, they tore off chunks of his flesh. Jim would later say that the only way that he remained sane was a very specific mental exercise. He let his mind leave his body to instead engage in the vivid fantasy of building a house, board by board, brick by brick, nail by nail. Slipping into this imaginary task kept his mind limber and stopped his every waking thought from sinking into pure despair of his situation. In late 1967, they marched the wounded and traumatized Jim out of their camp, and they made him walk blindfolded all the way to North Vietnam. He was once again horrifically tortured in order to get him to sign a propaganda statement that called the war in Vietnam illegal and praised the Communist Army. When Jim refused at first, they not only choked him, beat him with more bamboo sticks, and hung him up by his thumbs, they also taught him to bow. Specifically, a fighter grabbed him by the back of the head and slammed his face down into the hard earth until he fell unconscious. He realized then that he didn't have any real choice. It was either sign the statement or die. And he still had his family to think about back home. In 1968, after years of isolation, Jim was given over from the Viet Cong to the North Vietnamese, and that is how he became just another resident at the infamous Hoa Lo prison, also known as the Hanoi Hilton, which was a notoriously brutal prison at the time. At least Jim wouldn't be alone there, and that made him feel like this change of circumstances was an upgrade. He hadn't spoken to another American for 5 years, and by this point he was so malnourished that one of the other prisoners would later say of him, quote, "He looked like something out of Auschwitz." In 1971, Jim would stage his most daring escape from his captors, and he managed to be free for 2 whole days before being recaptured by the North Vietnamese. This news made it back to the US military, definitely confirming that Jim was alive and imprisoned, not dead like everyone had feared. He earned a Silver Star for this, but when the military asked Alice's permission to now publicize the fact that Jim was alive and captured, she refused. She still didn't believe that her husband would be coming back, and this would have heartbreaking consequences for Jim later. 2 years later, with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords that ended the aggression between the United States and Vietnam, it was time to bring Jim home. Under the auspices of Operation Homecoming, he and 590 other American prisoners of war were brought back to the U.S. via the Philippines. He later recounted being given a new Green Beret at Clark Air Base and swore to himself in that moment that nobody would ever, metaphorically speaking, take it away from him. After almost 9 years of suffering, he was free from the horrors of being a prisoner of war. But back home, so many new nightmares were still waiting for him. On the very slim bright side, he received 2 promotions in light of his service, first to lieutenant colonel and then full colonel. But these promotions were almost just symbolic. While it had undeniably been a show of truly unique strength and willpower on a personal level, spending 9 years being tortured doesn't prepare you to lead an army, especially one in peacetime. He'd lagged behind his contemporaries severely, and without a formal college education, as a man in his middle age, he seemed like a living relic. And even beyond the military, the world had changed substantially during the 9 years Jim had spent bound in ropes and locked up in bamboo cages. Between 1964 and 1973, America had undergone a substantial cultural change. He had missed everything from the moon landing to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Classic Americana had evolved into the hippie free-love culture of the mid to late 60s, before creeping into the brooding, gritty cynicism of the 70s. He had missed the Voting Rights Act, the Manson family murders, the counterculture movement, the birth of feminism, the sexual revolution, and he was back just in time for the fuel crisis and Watergate. For Jim, returning home wasn't a relief, it was like stepping onto another planet. The world he had left behind had moved on without him, and that was even truer of Jim's family. Alice, believing Jim lost forever to the jungles of Vietnam, had moved on, remarrying an army sergeant that she met at a bowling alley years after Jim's disappearance. With her support system in ruins and hope dwindling, it felt like the only way forward. Jim's children were so young when he left they barely remembered him. He was already so absent from their lives due to his military career that the memories they had of him were at best hazy. With his world and his family transformed beyond recognition, it seemed like Jim's grim accolade, being the longest surviving American prisoner of war from the Vietnam War, would be his sole comfort. But even that didn't come easy, because Alice had refused to go public in 1971 when the news broke that Jim was alive and in captivity. His story remained largely in the shadows, even after his rescue. As a result, the official record for the longest-held POW was attributed to another veteran, Navy Lieutenant Commander Everett Alvarez, who was captured 4 months after Jim during the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Jim had inadvertently been relegated to a footnote in the war despite all of his pain, and while the record was corrected in the end, his feelings of betrayal toward the military brass and Alice never really left him. In many ways, Jim was a ghost of himself back in the U.S., a decorated soldier but a broken man, haunted by betrayal and broken bonds. Jim's bitterness ran deep. The collapse of his marriage, the denial of his unimaginable suffering, and the emotional distance from his children became a volatile mix. He was said to have become a violent drunk who often ranted at and beat his wife and children. He was also tormented by terrifying nightmares of his time in the jungle prisons. It's no wonder then that his youngest boy, the one who had been born the night after his capture, tragically named Floyd Jr., saw his father as little more than a frightening stranger, an invader in his and his family's life. His mother's second husband had been more of a dad to him than Jim ever had. But would Jim have become a better husband and father if life hadn't taken so much from him? Going through what he went through, did he ever really have any chance to become the person he was supposed to be? Sometime after the end of his marriage with Alice, he remarried, but this wouldn't last for long. The extensive trauma Jim had suffered, coupled with the alcoholism, bitterness, and depression he faced back in the States, made him a hard person to be around. The second marriage ended in divorce, and he continued to dabble in self-destructive behavior after he was estranged from every interpersonal connection in his life. Making matters worse, he had the truly ungodly double whammy of a massive heart attack and a stroke in 1981 that once again left him a prisoner, but this time in his own body. He was in a coma for months before he awoke with partial paralysis and limited speech, which destroyed his connection to one of the last things in his life that he truly cherished, the military. The year after his health problems, he was forced to retire. In some ways, this was just the straw that broke the camel's back. His superiors claimed that he likely would have been discharged from the military years earlier for his chronic drinking problem if it wasn't for his status as a war hero. They were, in a sense, just keeping him around all that time out of pity, as he was bounced between military hospitals to get treatment for the bevy of health problems caused by his alcoholism. Effectively, they had taken Jim Thompson's Green Beret away from him. Having lost pretty much everything, he became a recluse in his single-bedroom condo. Even being awarded the Prisoner of War Medal by President Reagan in 1988 felt like little more than another symbolic victory. People wouldn't see Jim leave his condo for weeks at a time in the twilight years of his life, and essentially the only time others saw him was at events for veterans and military personnel, the closest thing to any kind of family he had left. As if to add to the ever-growing pile of tragedies that Jim's life had become, his only son was convicted of murder in 1990 and sentenced to 16 years in prison. It tarnished what little of a living legacy he had. Misfortune would continue to follow his family. Alice died in 2009 from cancer, and one of his daughters, Ruth, lost her son and suffered from 3 disabling heart attacks. Jim himself passed away in 2002 at the age of 69 from a heart attack in his home in Key West, Florida. A life likely cut short by the sheer level of stress on his body and mind, put under during almost decades of imprisonment and the tumultuous time that followed. Jim's story would go on to be immortalized in nonfiction books like Glory Denied, The Saga of Jim Thompson, and the modern opera of the same name, along with countless articles and videos. Colonel Thompson may have suffered in life, but through his ability to hold strong during torment that the rest of us would find unimaginable, he'll forever be a legend in death. Some POWs would do anything to escape. Check out World War II Prisoner Escapes Through Toilet to see how one man flushed his way to freedom, or click on this video instead.